Intense, over-the-top action, larger-than-life summons, deep, complex stories wrapped around a rich, dark fantasy setting? Sign me up! It's about time to start discussing Final Fantasy XVI and all the game has to offer, as we don't have to wait much longer until we can finally start playing it on June 22nd this year. This 16th mainline entry is unlike any we've seen before in the franchise, and has many new aspects introduced to the series that are worth discussing and be excited about. Join me as we go through a general overview of this game and why this new Final Fantasy title should be on your radar. Let's briefly talk about the story, as it isn't a Final Fantasy game without massive crystals and big summons, right? Set in the world of Valisthea, this is a bleak yet geographically expansive world with 6 nations housing their own unique crystal and weapons of mass destruction, known as icons. Icons are this game's version of traditional Final Fantasy summons, like Ifrit, Shiva, Bahamut, and the like, and these icons are manifested by human wielders known as dominants. These dominants represent their respective nations and are ultimately brought into conflict with one another by an ever-pervasive blight that seeks to consume the land it touches. We assume the role of protagonist Clive Rosefield, who sets off on a revenge quest as he witnesses his own kingdom get destroyed by the rising political turmoil and conflict. Throughout the game, we play through various times of Clive's life, starting out when he was age 15 until playing as an adult and beyond as the story progresses, a component to Final Fantasy XVI that differentiates itself from the previous entries greatly. Clive is not a dominant, per se, as he does not harness the full powers of these summons at birth, but as time progresses, he is able to absorb and use aspects of those icons over time, until actually harnessing his own icon, Ifrit, of which you can see on screen. As this is more of an overview video of Final Fantasy XVI, I am not going to spend too much time going over the game's story, and will instead reserve proper story exposition for a future video. Needless to say, this Final Fantasy tale is quite a bit darker than its siblings, both in its setting, subject matter, and themes the game dabbles with. The game's producer, Naoki Yoshida, explains that the shift into a darker fantasy tale was for the game to hopefully resonate with a wider audience, and thus reinvigorate the series. Speaking of combat, Final Fantasy XVI makes incredible deviations away from the series' norm with its combat system, widely ditching the command-based real-time combat systems as of late, and instead favoring entirely fast-paced action combat systems more akin to something like God of War and Devil May Cry. In fact, veteran combat designer of the DMC series, Ryota Suzuki, was brought into the project to helm the combat system for Final Fantasy XVI, further removing it from its more slower-paced roots and injecting it with fast, stylish action. Sounds pretty different, right? Well, couple that with the confirmation that Clive is the only character that players have direct control over is yet another aspect that deviates it from the norm. Although that may leave fans of this long-running RPG series weary of the lack of options when playing through this game, the vast systems at play here, along with the various equipment, skills, and sheer combat abilities Clive can utilize, should at least reassure some fans that the variety may still be present here, albeit solely tied to one playable character. That doesn't mean that Clive will go about his battles solo though, as there will be a roster of characters that will accompany Clive throughout the game as passing party members. These party members operate on their own, and for those who have played the game in preview events, remarked that they proved their usefulness and never felt like they had to babysit their battle performance. Clive is also accompanied by his trusty dog, Torgal, who is often providing backup support and creates meaningful distractions for Clive to lay waste to foes. As the player progresses through the game, Clive will absorb the abilities of the icons he comes into contact with, being able to imbue his attacks with the elements and characteristics of these industry staple summons. In the most recent demo previewers were invited to play, we saw Clive operate and utilize the characteristics of Phoenix of Fire, Garuda of Wind, and Titan of Earth. Players are able to freely swap between each of these skills on the fly, and are incentivized to do so, as their respective cooldowns never last too long. Complementing these magical abilities with Clive's aggressive sword strikes is what keeps the game's more action-focused system flowing and creative, with Phoenix's more agile fire strikes complementing Titan's more tactical charged-up attacks that deal massive damage. Don't forget Garuda's wind abilities, as these devastating attacks do wonders in juggling enemies, further depleting an enemy's stagger gauge. Similar to Final Fantasy VII Remake's stagger gauge, enemies in Final Fantasy XVI are able to be staggered, rendering enemies immobile and able to sustain incredible amounts of damage while in that state. These elemental attacks have their own skill trees, as does Clive's regular attacks, so these can be expanded upon further with experience allocation. Before we transition out of combat and into world design and exploration, let's talk about the boss fights with the icons. These bosses, as you can see on screen with the player controlling Ifrit against Garuda, are pure spectacle in over-the-top power fantasy form. While these fights are not meant to be overly challenging, what they do provide is a rush that many longtime fans of the series only dreamt of as a kid, picturing mighty summons pit against another in a battle to the death. The more I see these, the more I can't wait to play the game and see what more battles are in store for us, and they are surely rewards for the player upon overcoming some of the game's challenging boss fights that came before. Speaking of challenge, the game has an unorthodox way of incorporating difficulty modes, as the game is broken down into two modes: action focus and story focus. Story Focus is a mode in which the player is given an assortment of 5 unique rings that may be equipped in Clive's inventory slots. Such rings simplify the attacks and skills to only be tied to a single button, or giving the player a larger window to dodge attacks. While these are simply useful and will reduce some of the challenge to the game, players will have to equip whatever ring they want to use to an equipment slot, which will undoubtedly task players with choosing what they want to prioritize: a gameplay modification ring, or an accessory that can boost Clive's stats. Brilliant stuff, and I am fascinated to see if other games will implement something like this in upcoming titles. The game is set in a vast, geographically diverse world, full of nations and cultures that are brimming with detail and personality, and as a surprise to many, this game will not be an open world game. Instead, FF16 will be a linear game that contains traditional linear level design with some branching paths and open areas for the player to explore. Having these larger areas punctuate the game that is decidedly more linear than its previous and more open, Final Fantasy XV, will indeed seek to keep the pacing going while also giving players time to unwind and venture off the beaten path. While we do not know the extent of what players can do in these larger play spaces, we do know that chocobos, moogles, and traditional staples of Final Fantasy will be present in the game. Will we see an intricate chocobo breeding component like the one in Final Fantasy VII in this game? Actually, now that I think of it, we may not have to wait long to see if that's included in the follow-up to FF7 Remake. Regardless, I am happy to see that there are more open spaces to explore, along with the linear design taken from previous Final Fantasy games, like Final Fantasy X and 13. The game will be launching as a timed exclusive on the PS5, with news that a PC version will release likely after 6 months or possibly even longer. The game comes out on June 22nd this year, and I will absolutely be doing a giveaway of the game, so stay tuned as I will be starting that giveaway in May. So, are you excited for FF16? What do you think of its new battle system and mechanics? Let me know below. If you are interested in the recent Resident Evil 4 remake, go ahead and check out this playlist on the incredible lore within that game. More Final Fantasy XVI content to come real soon, so make sure to stay right here for the latest and greatest for the upcoming JRPG. Thanks a lot for the incredible support. Peace!